Imagine being a German pilot in 1945 and realizing, in a single breathtaking moment, that everything you thought you knew about modern war was already obsolete. The morning air over Rechlin Air Base was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Frost clung to the seams of every hangar door, and silence hung over the tarmac like a final prayer whispered before dawn. Rechlin had once been the pride of German aviation, a place where Messerschmitts were pushed to their limits, where prototypes screamed across the sky like silver arrows. But now, in early 1945, the base felt hollow, tired, like a place that understood, deep in its bones, that history was changing faster than it could keep up. Yet even in that bleak winter gloom, something astonishing stood on the runway that morning, so out of place it felt almost unreal. A massive silver giant, its polished skin catching the weak sunlight, its wings stretching nearly 100 feet across the frozen concrete. A Boeing B-29 Superfortress. To the German pilots and engineers gathering around it, the sight was almost impossible to comprehend. This machine wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't supposed to fall into enemy hands. And more than that, it wasn't supposed to exist at this scale, with this level of power, at this stage of the war. But there it was. 4 colossal radial engines, a cockpit like a glass cathedral, a fuselage built not merely to carry bombs, but to carry a nation's industrial confidence across an ocean. And as the Germans approached it, step by slow step, something inside each of them shifted. Captain Hedman Bombach, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, ran a gloved hand along the cold aluminum. He had flown everything Germany ever built. He had tested the Me-262, felt the raw hunger of jet power beneath him. He had flown captured Spitfires and P-47 seconds, aircraft that had impressed him but never shaken him. But this was different. "This is not a bomber," he whispered to the men beside him. "This is a message." Behind him stood engineers, men who had spent years wrenching miracles out of starving factories and dwindling supplies. Men who understood steel, pressure, power, and sacrifice. And yet, as they stood before the B-29, they felt something they had not felt in years. Wonder and fear. Klaus Hoffmann, Rechlin's chief engineer, stared up at the Wright R-3350 nacelle like a man looking into the open jaw of a mythic beast. He knew German engines intimately, the DB 605 seconds that strained for every bit of horsepower they could muster, the BMW 801 seconds that overheated, stumbled, and finally surrendered under endless shortages of alloys and manpower. But the plaque on the B-29 engine told a different story. 200 horsepower per engine. In a single moment, Hoffmann felt a truth he had always suspected but never dared say aloud. Germany was years behind. Not months, not a season, years. The Germans gathered in silence, the bitter cold forgotten as they examined the giant before them. Every detail of the B-29 seemed designed not to impress but to endure. It wasn't a masterpiece created by craftsmen. It was a war machine built by an industrial empire, and that was the part that hurt the most. German aircraft were precision instruments carefully assembled, tuned, fussed over. Each one carried the fingerprints of the workers who built them. But this B-29 looked as though it had rolled off an assembly line where machines and men worked in perfect unison, producing power on a scale the Reich could no longer imagine. Bombach stepped into the cockpit next, and the breath caught in his throat. The glass canopy opened like a doorway into another world, spacious, heated, pressurized. He touched the controls, smooth, balanced, almost gentle. The kind of cockpit where a crew could fly 10 hours without freezing, where the pilot didn't have to wrestle his aircraft into submission. For a long moment, Bombach said nothing. He simply looked. Then quietly, with a heaviness that felt like defeat settling on his shoulders, he murmured, "This is how they've been fighting their war, and we never understood." The crew compartments were pressurized. The controls were boosted hydraulically. The defensive guns were operated remotely by analog computers. The entire aircraft was an integrated ecosystem, each part supporting the next, every system strengthening the whole. It wasn't just advanced, it was unified. In the glow of that realization, the German officers finally saw the truth the war had been trying to teach them for years. America was fighting with an entirely different philosophy, one that didn't rely on heroics, improvisation, or last-minute miracles. America fought with systems, with industry, with depth. With time. The B-29 was simply the physical embodiment of all those things. Hoffman ran his fingers across a wiring junction. The number of cables alone astonished him. Miles of copper, untouched by shortages, untouched by bombing raids, untouched by desperation. Every connection neat, labeled, standardized. This wasn't a machine that survived being built during a war. It was a machine that thrived because of the war effort behind it. Standing there, the German engineers weren't merely looking at an airplane. They were looking at the industrial soul of the United States. And it was overwhelming. Somewhere outside, the winter wind scraped across the tarmac, but nobody noticed. Every man in that cockpit understood something profound. The war was already lost long before this B-29 ever touched German soil. Not because German pilots lacked courage, not because German engineers lacked brilliance, but because the scales of industry, manpower, and material had never been equal, not even at the beginning. And as Bombach finally stepped back from the Superfortress, he felt a deep, quiet humility settle inside him. A realization filled with both awe and sorrow. "We were never fighting the same war," he whispered. They removed the cowling on the No. 3 engine just after noon, when a thin winter sun hung low over Rechlin. The mechanics worked slowly, their gloves stiff with cold, their breath drifting like fog each time they exhaled. Even before the metal panels came off, the German engineers could feel the size of the engine beneath, like a slumbering animal waiting to be revealed. And then, with a final metallic groan, the panels dropped away. Silence fell instantly. Even the wind seemed to pause. There, exposed to the freezing air, was the heart of America's most advanced bomber, the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, an 18-cylinder radial beast unlike anything the Germans had ever seen up close. Klaus Hoffmann stepped forward first. He had built engines his whole life. He had tested the DB-605 until his hearing nearly gave out. He had examined the Jumo 211, run his hands across the BMW 801, memorized every bolt and bearing of Germany's proudest designs. But as he looked at the R-3350, he felt something no German engineer ever wanted to feel. Small. This engine was enormous, physically massive, mechanically intricate, and frighteningly refined. Its dual rows of 9 cylinders curved outward like a crown of steel, each cylinder an emblem of American manufacturing power. 2,200 horsepower, someone whispered. But Hoffmann was already thinking beyond the number. He was analyzing shapes, lines, connections, seeing the story in the metal itself, and what he saw unsettled him deeply. The supercharger alone looked like something from another age, a huge, beautifully cast piece of machinery, perfectly fitted to the rear of the engine, not a handmade one-off, not the result of improvisation or field modification. This was the kind of component produced by foundries that had mastered precision casting decades earlier, foundries fed by reliable supplies of nickel, chromium, aluminum, and high-grade steel. Germany no longer had any of those. He crouched lower, studying the cooling baffles inside the cowling ring. American engineers had guided airflow across every cylinder face with astonishing efficiency. The ducts were shaped perfectly, not bent by hand, not hammered into place, not forced to fit despite shortages. Everything here was intentional. Everything had been designed, not tolerated. And then Hoffmann noticed something else, something that made his stomach tighten. The entire engine was mounted on a quick-release frame. One pull, one slide, one lock. The whole power plant could come off in minutes. A complete module, replaceable as a unit. Install a fresh engine, tighten the mounts, and the aircraft could be airborne again. It was the kind of engineering that only existed when you had factories running day and night, unlimited quantities of spare parts, standardized machining, a workforce trained to perfection, and industrial capacity so vast that replacing an entire engine was cheaper than repairing one safe. Germany had none of these things left in 1945, and if Hoffmann was honest, had never truly possessed them at scale. One of the younger engineers stood back, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Herr Hoffmann, how are the Americans building engines like this, and in such numbers?" Hoffmann didn't answer, at least not immediately. He kept studying the engine mount, the welds, the control linkages, everything too clean, too consistent, too perfect to be handmade. Then he stood upright, staring at the aircraft towering above them. "Finally," he replied quietly, "they're not building them." he posed. "They're manufacturing them." The distinction was devastating. Germany crafted engines, with skill, care, and pride, but with improvisation, with shortages, with men working by hand because machines were scarce and time was scarcer. The Americans produced engines, by the thousands, identical, repeatable, standardized, quality-checked in facilities that dwarfed anything Germany owned. They had casting plants capable of running at full output even during wartime. They had forging capacity untouched by bombs. They had assembly lines inspired by Detroit, powered by a nation that had never known true scarcity. The men around Hoffman absorbed this truth silently. Bombach, watching from behind, felt the same sinking realization. If America could mass-produce an engine like this, an engine far beyond anything the Reich had in reliability, power, and cooling, then what else could they build? What might already be in development? "And this is only the R-3350, Hoffman murmured, half to himself. "They may have something even larger." He was right, though he didn't yet know it. America was already developing the R-4360, a 28-cylinder monster. But the R-3350 alone was enough to expose the full scale of the gap. Hoffman instructed his assistant Schmidt to examine the propeller reduction gearbox. Schmidt leaned in, studying the gears through the inspection ports. After a moment, he exhaled sharply, almost in disbelief. "These tolerances," he whispered. "How can they machine this so precisely? Every edge, every gear tooth, perfect." Hoffman knew the answer. Machine tools. Not the small, overloaded German workshops where older lathes shook themselves apart from overwork. Not facilities forced to move underground or scatter across the countryside after Allied bombing. The Americans had thousands of the world's best machine tools, mills, grinders, lathes, precision cutters, all running off stable electricity, all fed by steady streams of material. The R-3350 wasn't just an engine, it was a symbol of everything Germany lacked. And as Schmidt continued inspecting the gearbox, Hoffman noticed the look on his young assistant's face. It wasn't envy, it wasn't admiration, it was exhaustion. Because Schmidt and all of them understood that even if Germany could copy the design, they could not copy the system that made it possible. A perfect blueprint means nothing without factories. Factories mean nothing without resources. Resources mean nothing without workers. And workers mean nothing without time. Germany had none of these. A few minutes later, Bombach stepped closer to Hoffman. His voice was low, almost subdued. "Do you think we could ever build one like this?" Hoffman stared at the engine a long time before answering. "In theory, yes. One, maybe two. With difficulty." He turned to face Bombach fully. "But thousands?" He shook his head softly. "Never." The wind swept across the runway, tugging at their coats. In that moment, the engine in front of them, silent, cold, motionless, felt louder than any truth they had ever heard. This was the cost of underestimating industrial war. This was the moment they understood that courage, innovation, and sacrifice were not enough when facing a nation that could summon an entire continent's worth of machinery and manpower. The R-3350 didn't proclaim superiority. It demonstrated it, quietly, unavoidably, completely. And the German engineers, who had dedicated their lives to mastering the science of flight, could only stand there and acknowledge what none of them wished to say aloud. "We have fallen behind a country that builds technology faster than we can imagine it." The cockpit of the B-29 was the first thing that made the German pilots stop breathing for a moment, not because of its size, though it was spacious, or because of its elegance, though it was beautifully arranged. It was because of what it represented. The moment Captain Hedman Bombach stepped into that glass-fronted command center, he could feel it. He wasn't inside a bomber. He was standing inside the mind of an industrial nation that had prepared for a kind of war Germany had never imagined. The glass canopy wrapped around him like the front of a modern airliner, the world opening wide in every direction. The seats comfortable, padded, far from the cold metal skeletons the Luftwaffe used, were placed inside a pressurized cabin, not a small pod for reconnaissance, a whole front compartment, a heated, sealed environment where the pilot and crew could fly for 10 hours without frostbite gnawing at their fingers. To a Luftwaffe pilot in 1945, this felt like stepping into the future. Bombach rested his hands on the yoke. It felt light, impossibly light, hydraulically boosted. He moved it gently, and the controls responded like a shadow obeying its source. No heavy resistance, no muscling the aircraft into submission. This bomber, this 100,000-pound giant, could be guided with 2 fingers. He whispered, half in awe and half in sadness. Even our fighters don't feel this smooth. Behind him, the German engineers were already examining the crew layout. They stared at the small, pressurized tunnel that stretched above the bomb bay, linking the forward and aft compartments. A passageway that allowed the gunner team to move freely without freezing, without oxygen masks digging into their faces, without the screaming wind rattling their bones. 11 men, Hoffman murmured, working in comfort at 30,000 feet. The words tasted bitter. German bomber crews had suffered endlessly, oxygen masks frosting, instruments freezing, fingers turning numb during long missions. And here, in the heart of American engineering, the crew of a B-29 flew in shirt sleeves, protected by technology Germany simply couldn't afford to develop. But the cockpit was only the beginning. When the engineers reached the gunnery stations, the shock became even deeper, because nothing here made sense to German eyes. Remote-controlled turrets, electric motors, gyro-stabilized gun sights, analog computers calculating bullet trajectory in real time. They had never seen anything like it. 4 remote turrets, 2 upper, 2 lower, each armed with 50-caliber machine guns, and each turret could be controlled by a gunner sitting in a protected, heated compartment, looking through an advanced computing gun sight that automatically corrected for range, altitude, temperature, airspeed, bullet fall, and even the motion of the aircraft itself. One gunner could command multiple turrets at once. 2 gunners could coordinate fire so precisely that any fighter approaching from above or below would fly straight into a lethal cone of bullets. Germany had brilliant engineers, but this was something different. Not brilliance integration, not ingenuity systems thinking, not heroics automation. Hoffman stared at the cables and circuitry. How does all this work together? He whispered. Miles of electrical wiring, thousands of connections, machine-finished components that looked identical to one another not because of craftsmanship, but because they came from factories capable of mass-producing precision itself. Germany didn't have those factories anymore. Many had been erased by Allied bombs. Others had been scattered, moved underground, staffed by exhausted workers with dwindling supplies. The Americans, on the other hand, had factories like cities, places where automated machines stamped, shaped, drilled, welded, and tested parts with relentless consistency. Even the luxuries of the crew cabin, the visibility, the heat, the pressure were more than comforts. They were strategic advantages. Pilots fighting fatigue could think more clearly. Gunners who weren't freezing could track targets longer. Crews who weren't suffocating could survive missions that stretched over oceans. The Germans began to understand something uncomfortable. This aircraft wasn't designed for bravery. It wasn't built for desperation. It was built for efficiency, for repeatability, for war that lasted years, not months, for distances that spanned continents, not borders. Bombach settled back into the pilot's seat. Through the glass, he saw the runway glistening under the winter sun. He imagined this aircraft rising into the sky with a crew of 11 Americans who felt safe, protected, supported by their machine, not fighting it the way Luftwaffe crews fought theirs. This ship, Bombach said slowly, does not demand courage from its crew. It gives them confidence instead. Hoffman placed a hand on the frame above the gunner's station. The metal felt warm beneath his glove, warmed by the heating system that ran through the pressurized fuselage. "We could never build this," he said softly. And this time, there was no envy in his voice, only truth. "Not because we lack the knowledge, but because we lack the foundation. This is not an airplane. This is an entire industry. Flying." The men fell quiet. They were no longer comparing machines. They were comparing nations. America's strength wasn't in the B-29 alone. It was in the endless river of resources, factories, engineers, and workers standing behind it. It was in the stable supply lines, the unbombed foundries, the abundant metals, the organized assembly lines. And Germany, by 1945, had none of those. Inside that cockpit, surrounded by hydraulic lines, pressurized seals, computing gun sights, and remote-controlled firepower, the Germans understood something few soldiers ever articulate. They were not fighting a country. They were fighting a continent, a machine of machines, a system of systems, and they were outmatched not in courage, not in intelligence, not in willpower, but in the quiet, unyielding strength of industrial supremacy. Bombach exhaled slowly. The glass in front of him blurred for a moment as his breath fogged the lower corner. "This," he said softly, "is why we are losing. Not bitterness, not anger, just acceptance. Because the truth was simple. Courage can win battles. Bravery can keep a plane flying. Skill can down an enemy fighter. But only industry, deep, organized, relentless industry, can win a war." The morning of the test flight came wrapped in a cold, so sharp it felt like it could cut through steel. Frost glazed the runway at Rechlin. The ground crew moved carefully, their boots crunching against the ice as they prepared the giant American bomber for something no German had ever attempted before, a flight under the hands of a Luftwaffe pilot. Captain Hedman Bombach stood at the foot of the B-29, head tilted upward. The silver wings stretched over him like the roof of a cathedral. Even after days of examining every bolt, every cable, every panel, the aircraft still gave him that strange feeling. It was as if he were standing before some kind of mechanical leviathan, a creature forged from industry itself, rather than a simple airplane. Behind him, Major Ernst Cooper approached quietly. "You ready for this?" Cooper asked. Bombach exhaled. "Ready or not, the airplane doesn't care." They climbed into the cockpit together. The interior smelled faintly of heated metal and canvas, a warm, human smell, unlike the cold, drafty cockpits German aircraft often had. Bombach settled into the pilot's seat, its cushions firm, supportive, almost comfortable. He felt the hydraulic controls respond the moment his hand touched the yoke, as if the machine were waking beneath him. The flight engineer began the startup sequence. Engine 3, Engine 4, Engine 2, Engine 1. One by one, the Wright R-3350 came alive, each with a deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the air itself. The sound was not wild or temperamental. It was controlled, steady like the heartbeat of something powerful but disciplined. Bombach glanced at the gauges. Everything climbed smoothly. Oil pressure, manifold pressure, cylinder temperatures. No spiking, no rattling, no complaints. That alone felt surreal. He had flown countless German aircraft that groaned their way into motion, engines that needed coaxing and luck just to behave during startup. But the R-3000, 350 seconds, they simply worked. With a slow push on the throttles, the B-29 began rolling. The nose wheel tracked straight, steady. The aircraft didn't feel like 50 tons of metal, it felt alive. When they lined up on the runway, Bombach took a breath that trembled just slightly. He eased the throttles forward. The response was instantaneous. The bomber surged down the runway with a smooth, muscular force that startled him. The engines roared, but they didn't strain. They didn't complain. They simply delivered power, clean, reliable, overwhelming power. At 80 knots, Bombach gently pulled back. The B-29 rose gracefully, like it had been waiting all morning to return to the sky. No vibration, no shudder, just lift. As the bomber climbed, Bombach felt something unfamiliar, ease. Even at reduced power settings to save fuel, the aircraft clawed upward at over 1,000 feet per minute. He leveled off at 15,000 feet, hands barely resting on the yoke. The bomber flew smooth and balanced, like a giant bird gliding on invisible rails. Cooper leaned over, voice low with disbelief. "Feels like flying a dream." But Bombach wasn't dreaming. He was awakening. The aircraft responded to every touch with precision. Roll left smooth, steady, roll right effortless. Pitch adjustments felt almost delicate. The hydraulic boosts made the controls light, almost elegant, in a way no German heavy aircraft even approached. He thought of the Heinkel 177, the Luftwaffe's troubled heavy bomber. Flying that was like fighting a bear. Every banking maneuver felt like an arm wrestling match. Every hour in the cockpit drained a pilot's strength. And worst of all, the engines had a dreadful habit of catching fire mid-flight. But the B-29? This 100,000-pound colossus flew with the grace of a fighter. Bombach tried a shallow dive. The airspeed increased steadily, predictably. The bomber didn't buffet or complain. It simply obeyed. Then he pulled up gently. The nose responded like a precise tool in the hands of an expert craftsman. He whispered to himself, "This aircraft, it wants to fly." For nearly an hour, Bombach tested its limits. Climbs, banks, acceleration, control coordination. Every system performed flawlessly. Every gauge stayed in the green. Every response was immediate and smooth. Not once did the bomber exhibit the slightest hint of mechanical trouble, and that frightened him, because it meant this wasn't a prototype. This wasn't a fragile jewel. This wasn't a handcrafted miracle. This was a production machine. If Germany had one aircraft like this, it would have been considered a national treasure, flown only by elite crews, guarded constantly, cherished like a scientific marvel. But America? America was building them by the thousands. Bombach looked over at Cooper, who sat quietly, staring out at the clouds. "You feel it too, don't you?" Bombach asked. Cooper nodded. "Yes. It's not just a bomber. It's certainty." He paused, searching for the words. A machine built by men who knew they could afford to make mistakes because they had the time and resources to fix them. Bombach swallowed hard. That was the truth. Germany had been improvising since 1942, patching shortages, adjusting designs, making sacrifices. But America had built the B-29 with the confidence of a nation not fighting with desperation, but with overwhelming capacity. After 90 minutes, Bombach guided the aircraft back down. The landing was smooth as silk, the bomber settling onto the runway like a giant bird touching the earth with care. When the engines shut down, silence filled the cockpit. Bombach sat there, staring at the darkened gauges, the still yoke, the motionless engines. It felt like the end of something, not just the end of the flight, the end of an illusion, the illusion that Germany could still win through ingenuity alone, the illusion that bravery could outrun industry, the illusion that skill could overcome scale. Cooper finally broke the silence. "Not a single malfunction," he said. "Not one." He shook his head, his voice heavy. "This aircraft was perfect." Bombach closed his eyes. "No," he whispered. "It was inevitable. Because in that cockpit, at 15,000 feet over a dying Reich, he finally understood the truth. You can fight courage with courage. You can fight skill with skill. But you cannot fight a nation that builds machines like this. Not when every rivet, every wire, every engine reminds you that you are already too late." By March of 1945, the B-29 sat quietly in a hangar at Rechlin cold, still, waiting. The snow outside had begun to melt into thick grey slush, and the distant rumble of artillery echoed from the east. The Red Army was closing in. The Reich was collapsing. But inside that hangar, the German engineers and pilots had one final task: to write the report. Hoffmann sat at a wooden desk, pencil in hand, the mechanical giant looming behind him like a silent reminder of everything Germany had failed to achieve. The pages before him were filled with diagrams, notes, performance evaluations, yet every sentence seemed to point to the same unavoidable truth. Not one truth of weakness, not one of incompetence, but a deeper truth, the truth of scale. He wrote slowly, carefully, each word scratching across the paper like a confession. This aircraft represents a level of systems engineering and manufacturing integration that Germany cannot match. Not now, and not within the time available to us. The words tasted bitter, but they were honest. Across the hangar, Bombach walked around the B-29 for one last inspection. He touched the smooth metal as if trying to memorize its shape, its weight, its quiet confidence. This aircraft had changed something in him. It had stripped away the illusions that had fueled years of war. He had spent much of his life believing in German ingenuity, in the brilliance of the nation's engineers, in the courage of its pilots. He had believed that skill could bridge any gap, that determination could overcome any shortage, that cleverness could compensate for lack of resources. But this aircraft, this B-29, it taught him a lesson he wished he had never needed to learn. Courage builds heroes. Industry builds victory. He thought about the thousands of workers in American factories, men and women who had never seen combat, who would never hear the crash of flak or feel the terror of a dogfight, but who contributed something just as powerful. Every rivet they installed, every blueprint they followed, every hour they gave to the assembly lines created machines that shaped the fate of the world. Germany did not lack courage. It lacked continuity. It lacked stability. It lacked the deep industrial reserves that America had spent decades building long before the first shot of the war was fired. War had taught him that nations do not rise or fall on the bravery of their pilots alone, but on the quiet, relentless strength of their factories. Hoffmann finished the report just as the lights flickered overhead. The base generators were failing again, another sign of a country pushed beyond its limits. He walked toward Bombach, handing over the stack of papers. Bombach glanced through the pages. Every line cut a little deeper. The German aviation industry could theoretically design an engine comparable to the R-3350, one paragraph read, but it lacks the resources, the metals, the machining precision, the labor force, and the uninterrupted production capacity to manufacture such engines in the necessary quantities. Another line struck him even harder. The B-29 is not superior because its designers were smarter. It is superior because its nation's industry is larger, deeper, and better supplied. It is. Bombach closed the report, his hands heavy. "Do you think anyone will listen?" he asked quietly. Hoffman's tired smile said everything. "They will read it," he said, "but they won't understand it. Not until it's too late." The two men stood in silence, the B-29 towering over them like a monument to industrial might. Outside, the distant artillery grew louder. Inside, the truth settled on them like a weight they could no longer carry. The truth that Germany had not lost because its soldiers were less brave, nor because its engineers were less brilliant, nor because its pilots were less skilled. Germany had lost because modern war was no longer won by individual machines or individual men. Germany had lost because modern war was a competition of systems of supply chains, raw materials, factories, logistics, energy, and organizational discipline. The B-29 embodied that truth more clearly than anything else in the war. A machine built not just by hands, but by an entire nation working in unison. A machine made possible by peace before war, by decades of industrial investment. A machine that hinted at a future where engineering wasn't crafted, but manufactured. Bombach looked at it one final time. "This aircraft," he said softly, "is the war. This is what defeated us." Hoffman nodded. "And this," he added, "is what will shape the next one." They both knew the Soviets would reach Rechlin soon. They both knew the B-29 would be captured. But that no longer mattered. What mattered was the lesson written in rivets and steel before them. War belongs to the nation that can build faster than destruction, to the nation that can innovate while fighting, to the nation whose factories roar louder than its guns. The B-29 roared louder than all. And, as the Germans walked away, leaving the bomber silent in the dim hangar, they carried with them not just the knowledge of defeat, but the understanding of why. A truth born not from ideology, but from machinery. Not from politics, but from production. Not from the bravery of a single man, but from the unity of millions. And that truth, quiet, sober, unavoidable, would echo long after the war's final shot.